We're going to cover the basics of programming languages. The agenda for today is what is a programming language, front-end versus back-end, front-end languages, and back-end languages. What is a programming language? A programming language is what a programmer uses to tell the computer what to do. The language goes from what the programmer writes to the ones and zeros that the computer can understand through slightly different processes for different languages. So for instance, for Java, it would go through a process called compilation to get to the ones and zeros. For scripting languages like Python, it would just be run pretty much straight as it goes in a just-in-time kind of way. And it's important to remember that computers are stupid. The work they do is only as good as the programs that are written for them. Front end versus back end. So the front end is what the user interacts with. Basically, if you can see it, it's part of the front end code. So an example would be the color and shape of the button on the screen. That's part of the front end. The back end is the part of the code that does the heavy lifting. All the real computing is done on the back end. So a good rule of thumb is that if it touches a database, gets information, or manipulates information, it's part of the back end. So an example would be creating a profile on a website when you press the button. That's a back end operation because it's interacting with a database and storing information. Some front-end languages. So HTML and CSS, which are kind of languages, are used on the front end. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's a series of tags that creates the structure of a web page. And it can be written directly in a file and opened in a browser to view. So this is an example of some HTML code. You can see it's just a series of tags like head, meta, style. And this is what's used to create the structure of a web page. And then the CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet, is used to change the color, the font size, the background, etc. of a web page. It can either be put you can either put the styling in a separate .css file, in a style tag on the same page, or inline directly in the tags. And this is just a way to change the look and feel of a website. So some vocab before we go on. Object-oriented, it means a program is enabled to you can model a program as a set of objects that can be controlled and manipulated separately. It's modeled like how the real world works. So for instance, if you were going to create a model of a classroom, you would have an object for the whiteboard, and the whiteboard would have actions, like you could write on the whiteboard or erase from the whiteboard, that sort of thing. And that's the idea of object-oriented, is you create objects that interact with each other and can be moved and can be changed separately. Client-side, it's associated with the front end in web apps. In the abstract, the client side is the part that is requesting information or computation. And then on the server side, which is associated with the back end in web apps, and in the abstract, it's the part that's providing the information / computation. So client side is front end and server side is back end. To compile means to convert a program into a lower level language that can actually be executed on a machine. And dynamic can be changed or modified throughout the run of a program. JavaScript. So JavaScript is an object-oriented client-side scripting language. This means it has the ability to keep track of objects, is run in a browser, and doesn't need to be compiled before it's run. The browser gets the code and decides what to do with it as it's run. Some common flavors of JavaScript are jQuery, which is a library that allows for extra functionality. Some things like it creates a way to hit the back end more effectively. You can do some computations with jQuery, get objects on the page, that sort of thing. React.js is a library for building dynamic user interfaces, and AngularJS is a structural framework for dynamic web pages. So React and AngularJS are both used for dynamic pages, and they are similar, but the way that they're coded is different. So now for some backend languages. Java is a class-based, object-oriented, statically typed compiled language. It's one of the most commonly used programming language as it is straightforward to use and gives helpful errors when something goes wrong. Many companies use Java for their backend. So Java being statically typed means that its types for its variables don't change throughout the run of the program. And that'll make more sense later in a later session whenever we talk about how you actually program in Java. But for now, just know that the variable types don't change. It's object-oriented, which means it has the objects that we talked about in the vocab. And it is compiled, which means before you run it, it goes from the Java code into a different language that the machine can actually understand. So Python is a high-level object-oriented scripting language, and scripting languages aren't compiled before they're run. You run them and the computer interprets them as the program runs, which means you don't see any errors until you actually try to run the code, which can be frustrating. The language is slow, but it has a lot of libraries, so it's easy to do pretty much whatever the programmer wants. It's very good at performing math operations, and it's most often used for smaller pointed projects instead of large complex ones, because once you start getting a larger project with Python, it can get sort of unwieldy because you can't compile it, if you can run it and get a lot of errors, that sort of thing. And it's used for web apps at some companies for their backend. So C is a functional language, which means it is not object-oriented like Java or Python. And C is a compiled language. It's most often used for low-level work, like writing operating systems or firmware. And firmware is software that runs directly on hardware like cell phones. So if it's running on a chip, it's firmware. And that's it. I hope that was helpful.